in lieu of the recession that we are almost certainly currently already in, well, let's go ahead and talk about the further devaluation of the dollar. And I don't mean through inflation. We're talking about the fact of another rival challenger being put into the economic scene, and this being from the B.R.I.C.S nations. The B.R.I.C.S nations, which have been stockpiling gold and will soon have a summit in South Africa, I believe in Johannesburg, where they will be speaking about the fact of creating a new currency. This is the speculation, this is what people are talking about, and China has been stockpiling immense amounts of gold, so this is the one thing that people are concerned about, is that they will now have a gold-backed currency that will then rival the dollar, which it realistically won't actually rival the strength and power of the dollar because we're backed by Saudi oil as well as routed through the IMF and the World Bank. So it won't be as simple as just, look, we have a gold standard, now we win. Because the US dollar used to be a gold-backed currency, but we were removed off that standard from Nixon. And in the process, Nixon was like, well, this will only be temporary. And then it became permanent. And much like anything with the government, a temporary program will always be permanent because there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. So let's go ahead and jump into what Peter St. Onge has to say. He's an economist for the Heritage Foundation, a former Mises graduate, incredibly intelligent, wonderfully well-spoken. All the information will be sourced in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump into this and see what he has to say.
Central banks worldwide are on a gold buying spree as Joe Biden continues weaponizing the US dollar. But China stands out, hoovering up historic quantities of the yellow metal. So what is China planning? Yesterday, the Gold Telegraph reported that central bank gold purchases have mopped up almost a quarter of worldwide gold production this year as a parade of central banks retreat from the dollar. The standout buyer has been China. 2 days ago, its central bank announced it had bought another 16 tons of gold in May, bringing its total purchases to 144 tons since November. That would take China's total gold holdings to roughly 2,100 tons. Where did the money come from? Well, China has also sold off almost a quarter of its U.S. government treasuries since 2021, down from 1.1 trillion to 850 billion. So why is China getting out of the dollar? There's two interpretations, the conventional story and the nuclear story. The conventional argument says China's doing what everybody else is doing, preparing in case the U.S. weaponizes its own dollars against it, as Biden did with Russia and is now threatening to do to more countries over, of all things, LGBT policy. If so, the solution is very easy. Put the grown-ups back in charge who understand that reserve currency is a bigger question than retail politics. But then there's the nuclear story, that China is amassing gold in preparation for a gold-backed currency. In fact, both China and Russia have flirted with gold backing, but I don't think China would do it with their own currency, the yuan, because a paper yuan lets them underprice their exports, plus they can inflate at will. No, the idea is for China to stand up a fresh currency, perhaps tied to the B.R.I.C.S anti-dollar bloc, and back that with gold. Consider this is how countries use the dollar today. So Mexico or Korea don't use the dollar at home, they use their own cheap currency, and then they use the strong dollar as a trade rail. It's the best of both worlds. Cheap exports, strong rails. If China did a gold-backed brick, it would be an absolute game changer for the dollar because it would wipe out the US dollar as a store of value currency, which is the overwhelming reason that foreigners hold dollars in the first place. They're solid and they're liquid. Gold, of course, is much more solid than the dollar. The dollar has lost 85% of its value against gold in the past 20 years. The problem is gold is not very liquid. A gold-backed BRICS would be different. It would be a paper currency that is good as gold. Now, it wouldn't happen overnight, of course. People wouldn't immediately believe that it's really backed. But after a few months of people actually trading paper for gold, they would start to believe. One by one, they would flip trade invoices, central bank holdings, private bank holdings, investment flows. In 3 to 5 years, the currency world would be unrecognizable. Final point. If, in fact, China wants a gold-backed brick, how much gold do they need? Well, before Nixon, the U.S. only had about 2% gold cover, so $2 in gold for every $100 in M2. That means China's 2,100 tons could, in theory, cover a new currency worth about $6 trillion, which would make it the world's 5th largest currency just after the Japanese yen. I do not know if China's got the balls to do this, but if they do, our clowns in chief will not know what hit them. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.
As stated so perfectly by Peter St. Onge, The clowns in charge will have absolutely no idea what to do when they are greeted with a real rival or a real challenger that actually takes away part of their power. And we saw this with Libya and Gaddafi. And what happened to Gaddafi was there was just effectively a revolution from the bottom up that was spurred and revolted against him because he wanted to create a gold-backed currency called the dinar. And this would have allowed Africa to effectively escape control from under the dollar, which would allow them to have their own currency that was backed by gold, much like how we used to be, much like how the BRICS nations apparently intend to be. So let's go ahead and jump into Fortune. It says, how long will the dollar last as the world's default currency? The BRICS nations are gathering in South Africa this August with it on the agenda. So, could a new currency be set to challenge the dominance of the dollar? Perhaps, but that may not be the point. In August 2023, South Africa will host the leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, a group of nations known by the acronym BRICS. Among the items on the agenda is the creation of a new joint BRICS currency. As a scholar who has studied BRICS countries for over a decade, I can certainly see why talk of a BRICS currency is well gaining currency. The BRICS summit comes to a close as countries across the world are confronting changing geopolitical landscape that is challenging the traditional dominance of the West, which we've seen this consistently, and the one way that you would really challenge the dominance of the West would be to challenge their economic might, which would be through a new currency. So it says, and while the BRICS countries have been seeking to reduce their reliance on the dollar for over a decade, Western sanctions on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine have already accelerated the process, which, if we wanted to go ahead and effectively keep people like Russia under the unipolar world order that was structured by the United States after World War II, well, wouldn't you want to keep them under your economic ladder than ostracizing them? But we come down to the fact of foreign policy in the United States, and that Russia themselves is standing up against NATO, and NATO is a massive pillar for the world order. And the huge thing about the massive global hegemonic liberal world order that we see is that, well, if you encroach on the values that they will push, then you must be overthrown. And we saw this with Gaddafi in Libya. So, here it says, meanwhile, rising interest rates and recent debt ceilings crisis in the U.S. have raised concerns among other countries about their dollars denominated debt and the demise of the dollar should the world's leading economy ever default. Which, the U.S. is going to have to default on its debt eventually. When that happens, I don't know. But the thing is, it's going to happen. And they'll try and say that they've never defaulted on their debt. But we've done it before. I made a video on this. Go look at the history of the U.S. defaulting on its debt. I don't know exactly what the name of the video is, but you'll find it. It's about U.S. monetary policy and its history. So, here we see the de-dollarization momentum. With 88% of international transactions conducted in U.S. dollars, the dollar accounting for 58% of global foreign exchange reserves, the dollar's global dominance is indisputable. Yet de-dollarization, or reducing an economy's reliance on the U.S. dollar for international trade and finance, has been accelerating following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And just like St. Oj talked about the fact that countries like South Korea use their own currency within their own borders because it's cheaper to manufacture it and actually use it within their own borders, and then they'll use the U.S. dollar as a guiding rail to operate on foreign policy and then to operate on global trade. So here we see the BRICS countries have been pursuing a wide range of initiatives to decrease their dependence on the dollar. Over the past year, Russia, China, and Brazil have turned to greater use of non-dollar currencies in their cross-border transactions. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates are actively exploring dollar alternatives, and central banks have sought to shift more of their currency reserves away from the dollar and into gold. And we also see this with the shift from actual fiat currency, which is backed by the power of belief and faith, mind you not, if it isn't anything backed by the power of MMT, which MMT being modern monetary theory, which that's a conversation in itself for a different day. If you want to go see a proponent of someone who actually advocates for MMT, and I would argue does so honestly with good intentions, that would be Adam Friended of the Sitch and Adam Show. Wonderful show, great, purely entertaining, really enjoy it. They have a lot of great cultural commentary about the fact of what's going on. They're strictly centrist, and they call themselves enlightened centrists, but nonetheless, they are purely honest and good faith, and they do believe what they say, and if presented with truthful and factual information, they will change their mind, which is why I value what they say so greatly, because they challenge my biases as someone who is so vehemently against the state. So here we see all BRICS nations have been critical of the dollar's dominance for different reasons. Russian officials have been championing the de-dollarization to ease the pain from sanctions. Because of sanctions, Russian banks have been unable to use SWIFT, the global messaging system that enables bank transactions, and the West froze Russia's US $330 billion in reserves last year. I thought that said $30 billion, and I was like, well, there's no way they have so little amount of actual US dollars. But With the invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. completely detached the Russians from the SWIFT payment system, which then, in the process of doing so, they opened the door for China to effectively greet Russia on the doorstep and say, don't worry, we have payment options available for you to operate under, which is exactly what happened. So, meanwhile, the 2022 election in Brazil reinstated Luiz and Lula da Silva as president, who Lula is a socialist, he's a left-winger, and there was a massive uprising in Brazil effectively going against Lula to certify his election, somewhat of how there was here in the United States with January 6th, but again, conversation for a different day. It says Lula is a longtime proponent of BRICS who previously sought to reduce Brazil's dependence on and vulnerability to the dollar. He has re-energized the group's commitment to de-dollarization and spoken about creating a new euro-like currency, which that currency would be backed by gold. Here we see BRICS undermines the dollar hegemony with gold purchases. And this is from The Unheard, and The Unheard is pretty decent. I've read a couple stuff from them, and it always seems to be worth a read, if anything, no matter how much I've disagreed with the person writing it. So here it says, just before the new year, the Financial Times ran a piece noting that central banks were accumulating gold at a rate not seen in 55 years. In the third quarter of 2022, analysts estimate that 400 tons of gold were bought by central banks. That much gold would take around 16 semi-trailer trucks to transport. In November, traders in the gold market noted that there was a huge buyer entering the market and purchasing very large volumes of gold, a so-called whale. In December, it was revealed that this whale was the Chinese central bank. But it wasn't just the central Chinese bank buying gold. Other buyers included Turkey, India, Uzbekistan, Egypt, Qatar, and Iraq. It is worth noting that many of these countries have expressed an interest in joining the BRICS alliance. And the fact is that Iraq is talking about buying and vying themselves into gold when, without fail, the United States went in after 9/11, decimated Iraq, and took extreme amounts of stockpiles of their gold. God knows how much of it we took. You can go look at the pictures of U.S. soldiers standing in minting vaults, and they're standing there with these massive piles of bricks of gold, just tons and tons of this stuff, and they're standing there holding them up, taking pictures, smiling with them next to their face. So, it says, why are central banks snapping up gold? Well, here we get to it. Most commentators recognize that it's due to geopolitical turmoil. Partially. Jonathan Gutierrez of Fortune, for example, argues that gold is the currency of fear and mistrust, and the democratic West and the authoritarian East are pulling apart the mutual recriminations. So I would argue gold is a currency that holds great value simply because it's a currency that isn't based off inflation. It's a deflationary asset. There's only so much gold in existence, much like there's only so many Bitcoin, which is why the value of Bitcoin, despite the fact that it has increased exponentially, people still just continue to tarnish it and shit on it and step on it. And if you wanted to go ahead and look at a scale value of every stock in the United States, or the world, better yet, throughout the entire global financial market, and then also the value of the dollar and its skyrocketing point, and you want to look at its growth per capita due to its value in comparison to how much it's lost, well, what you'll see is, and if you'll compare this to Bitcoin, you'll see that Bitcoin is consistently and exponentially increased in value, whereas everything is relatively remained stable or decreased. And this is because, like I said, Bitcoin remains a deflationary asset. So, here we see, and I love this, it says, throughout history, gold backing has been used to buttress trust in currencies. While sterling, the gold reserve currencies, it would used to be just as good as gold. So, this is the big one for me. It says, throughout history, gold backing has been used to buttress trust in currencies, which what do we have now? We have a currency based off of the fiat standard that we can just endlessly print copious amounts of money to fund things like wars abroad, like sending, I don't know, $200 billion to Ukraine rather than saving the cities like Baltimore and Chicago, Portland, and all these wonderful, beautiful cities that have incredible people in them that have been absolutely destroyed and laid waste to by the fact of the cultural decay of the United States, and that we've been willing to spend billions abroad while not willing to invest anything domestic. So, it says, our period of paper currency is the exception rather than the rule, and it only started in 1971 when the US dollar was linked to the gold standard was broken. As I mentioned, Nixon took us off of that. In 1967, which we saw levels of gold purchases by the central banks comparable to what we observed in the end of 2022, all of this raises the obvious question. What if these purchases signal the beginning of the end of the paper dollar as the global reserve currency? And this is something that I want to tap into. What if it's the end of the global reserve currency is the paper dollar? Well, and then you would go and look at what the federal government is going ahead and pushing right now, and you would look at the fact that their next big ploy is going to be CBDCs. which is central bank digital currencies, which is effectively crypto, but this will be structured in a way, much like how it is in China, that they will be able to effectively track everything you purchase and monitor the process of everything that you do, because they'll be able to see every nook and cranny of how you already interact within the economy if you weren't already monitored enough via the tax system that taxes you at every nook and cranny that you already operate under in the economy. If any more surveillance under the economic system and then further taxation and being taxed even further into poverty sounds like something you would like, then I don't know. Maybe you should advocate for MMT. It seems unlikely that countries buying gold are going to give their currencies gold backing, but it appears probable that an immediate cause of the rush for gold is an attempt to diversify out of the dollar. Since the United States seized Russia's dollar reserves after the invasion of Ukraine last year, other countries have grown distrustful of holding dollars as they fear that they too could see their reserves seized in the future, hence the race for gold. Perhaps there's no plan behind the current gold rush, but it may read in retrospect as the beginning of a revolution of a new global monetary order. It could be the very first step towards reshaping the landscape as countries around the world try to find alternatives to the dollar. Bitcoin. The West is learning a hard and fundamental lesson. Financial systems are built on trust, and if they are weaponized, they lose trust and are required to maintain their dominance. It would be strongly in our self-interest to attempt to rebuild faith in our financial system if we want to protect our global order. I'm not concerned about global order or global power. I'm concerned about the people within the borders of the United States, and I want to make sure that we are established as the shining city on the hill for an icon and a beacon for people to strive for. Because that is what the United States was supposed to be, and that is what it represented, and that is what it was until we spent ourselves completely into debt, threw ourselves $32 trillion into debt, taxed our civilianry into poverty, and then decimated the culture. At what point throughout any time in history has an empire spent itself completely into debt, expanded itself way too thin and abroad militarily, and then the culture collapsed, and then everything just ended up fine? I can't think of one. But that's really all I've got for this. Go ahead and give this a thumbs up if you liked it, a thumbs down if you didn't, share this with someone if you enjoyed it, tell someone you love them, stay great, stay lovely, peace out.